I don't think there was anything I need to keep. It's not like I said any awesome zingers. Yeah.
We're warming up to the awesome zingers.
That's right. Well, this is the part where those would happen. So, or we could like do a chant. You ever do a chant before a improv or a theater thing?
You know, I used to do narrative improv a very long time ago, and what did we used to do? We tried all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that we found worked really well before a show was musical chairs.
Musical chairs. Just the straight game, right?
Well, we'd play the straight game sometimes. We'd at the sort of base level was playing it like 6-year-old children, but then we might introduce other characters. We might play it as pirates or as foreign exchange students.
So thematic musical chairs. That's great. Well, we can't do that very well on a podcast.
It's a difficult game to play with this distance between us.
Oh, it's a short game too, because there'd just be one chair.
Yes.
Oh, look, I won. Nailed it. Didn't even need the song.
Well, you're already sitting down, which is sort of cheating, I think, in that game.
Oh, I'm standing. I have a sit-stand desk. What about you?
Do you? No, I'm sitting.
You're sitting, okay.
Do you have one of those desks that goes up and down?
It's like a thing that sits on top of your desk that does the same thing.
Right, yeah.
I should look into that. I so rarely buy new furniture. The idea of buying an entirely new desk is like, whew, that's living the dream.
My other half has ADHD, and he's got the desk that goes up and down, and it's transformed his whole working life.
It's amazing.
And he paces around, and he sits down and lowers the desk, and then he stands up, and
that's great. Okay, well, I think that's enough chit chat. Let's get into it. Here we go. How do I start these things? Hey, welcome back to The Great and Secret Knowledge, a speculative fiction podcast. I'm your host, Jeff, and Lindsey had to leave the show for a time to deal with some personal stuff. So for now, it's me and a guest until I find that perfect special someone. So James, Lark, you are here. Welcome.
I am. Thank you.
All right. James, tell the listener who you are. What's it all about?
Well, who am I? That's always the $1 billion question, isn't it? I suppose the first thing to say is that my connection to this podcast is that I have written the theme for it because I am, in at least one walk of my life, a composer. So that's how we connected for this particular project. As well as being a composer, I am a writer and I'm a teacher. I teach in a specialist music school in London, so I'm teaching kids who are musicians, and that's useful background knowledge as well because of some of the things we're going to be talking about today as well. And I suppose the other thing to mention, because I think this is where the connection with Jeff started, is that I am a Doctor Who fan. So some of the contributions I have made to the content of the World Wide Web have been based around Doctor Who podcasts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for mentioning it. Yes, of course, James is the James Lark that composed our wonderful theme song and our interstitial music bits. James, such wonderful work. I'm so happy to have found you. And it's all thanks to Hamster with a Blunt Penknife, Joe Ford. And have you been on Strictly Come Hamster?
I have. I've done a couple of them,
Yeah.
actually. Always great fun. I did the one that was on John Pertwee's last season.
Would that be season 10?
Season 10, and I launched... season 11.
With Sarah Jane Smith.
With Sarah Jane Smith. And I launched a defense of the Monster of Peladon that took even me by surprise. And then I was on the one about the orphan episodes, the slightly between series episodes, things like The Power of the Doctor and Legend of the Sea Devils.
Oh, yes. Okay, yes. Oh, man. Joe puts out so much work, and now Joe and Rod puts out so much work, and it's all wonderful. Yeah,
he's a force of nature, and I've said it on other podcasts, and I'll say it here. Joe Ford is he's a real gift to the whole, to fandom. I'm going to say,
yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Star
to
Trek,
fandom.
Doctor Who, like
exactly,
just
yeah,
podcasts
all
in general.
He seems to come up with ideas very easily, and the thing that he's really good at is engaging with people. He's built up this very friendly network of people who are kind of like-minded. Well, I say like-minded, who disagree violently about pretty much everything in Doctor Who, but are able to do it in a really positive way. So it's a fun kind of disagreement rather than the kind of toxic relationship that occupies other areas of fandom.
Oh, yeah. It's so funny when we start to, when people in the nicer side of fandom start to talk about the intolerant a-holes that live over there, we get like real kind of quiet and like, how should I say this without alienating if any of their people came over here or if I had to meet them in the street? But
it's always difficult, isn't it?
There's some people that love drama and conflict and negativity, and it's nice to be in communities like the Ham Fam where that's less of a thing.
Yeah. Well, and just kind of this mutual agreement that we all love the program in a slightly different way, but fundamentally, the thing that binds us together is stronger than any disagreement over whether the Day of the Daleks special edition is better than the original or not.
Yes. So that's the fan side of things, and I definitely want to get more into your work as a composer and a writer and a teacher. First things first, though, I want to celebrate. I sent James a little message. Was like, hey, if you could put together a little a few sentences about the piece you wrote, or maybe a bio. And the thing you sent me was tremendous, and of course it is because you're also a writer. But I wanted to read this for the listener. Yeah, here we go. I won't do a James Lark impression. I was delighted to be asked to write music for a podcast exploring such rich ideas, though it represented an unusual creative challenge. Since speculative fiction crosses multiple genres, I felt that the theme ought to hint at several of them, without falling into any specific pastiche. What emerged was a bit of a juggling act, combining past and future, the whimsical and the frightening, hinting at things both familiar and strange. The dulcimer and harpsichord point towards the historical settings that many a writer has harvested, whilst synth sounds and the instantly recognizable theremin nod to sci-fi, as an orchestral backdrop builds in a way that is perhaps more familiar to aficionados of fantasy. In keeping with the idea of speculation, the material never quite settles, with layers of metallic percussion providing a constantly shifting harmonic backdrop to a theme that rises and falls in an unpredictable 7-8 meter, though even that refuses to stay put. That was a long but lovely written sentence. We're almost done. I'm like catching my breath.
Jeff has, for the listener, Jeff has turned purple and is just sort of gasping for oxygen.
Like the fiction the music was created to represent, the result was something of a logic puzzle to assemble, which I hope will engage listeners as they enter worlds that promise to be every bit as intriguing. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
I'd forgotten I'd said it that well myself, actually. That sounded quite good.
Yeah, I mean, basically I said, like, yeah, if it could be a little spooky, a little atmospheric, a little, I don't know, what did I say, synthy, plinky? And
yeah, a little bit,
you nailed it.
It's a little bit of everything, isn't it? And I mean, the last thing you want to do as well when you're commissioned to write something, specific for something as specific as this podcast is to turn out something that sounds like, stock music.
That's a great point. I just covered the first episode of Terry Pratchett's The Color of Magic. And halfway through, I was like, I'm enjoying this and it looks pretty, but the music right here sounds so generic.
Yeah.
And I was like thinking about it. I am a musician, but I've been away from composing and stuff for a long time. And so a lot of times I'll just be watching a show and it'll just kind of wash over me. But when it is unique and special, like your theme is, it definitely stands out and makes its mark.
I think it's an area. Don't set me off because I'll talk for 3 hours on just the state of film and television music. But I do think it's an area that's often not very well understood. I get it in the theatre as well. And I think sometimes just, very imaginative people in most areas, writers, producers, showrunners who have this wealth of creative imagination but are not musically trained, actually do want something that's generic because they haven't, it's not a thing for which they have the tools to imagine something better. And whereas in the olden days, we're talking many decades ago now, when the film composer had a kind of control that has been robbed from them now, partly just because of the way things were recorded. A film composer would write everything with particular, they would spot the film, write particular cues, and then record it as they had scored it, because that was all the technology allowed. Now, producers will demand that film scores are recorded in every single way possible, with all the solo instruments taken out and recorded individually, so that they have the option of saying, I think we'll try this bit without the clarinets. And the composer has no control over that. But the collaborative aspect, the idea that an expert, someone who is a musician and knows what they are doing, will come and bring their contribution to the film, has been taken away from that process, because people who are not experts ultimately have the say-so in how the music is going to be used.
Well, that's unfortunate news. I have strived not to mess with the people I work with music, but I did fade a little bit, but to change individual elements like that just horrified me to hear about it.
I mean, you're not working in a kind of a multi-million dollar industry, and I think that the sad thing is that quite often when things are not working, and we all know stories of test screenings and executives or people getting fired and someone else coming in and arbitrarily making changes, quite often it's kind of, what can we change to satisfy a demand for a change most easily. And because music is one of the last things to be put on, that's quite often the casualty of that.
Yeah. Wow. Imagine blaming the song for the movie doing badly at a test screening. I I can't
Well, it's
imagine.
more often than you would imagine.
Mm. Mm, mm, mm. Well, okay. I'm gonna write down this controversy and circle back to it. Let's see.
There's a
Go ahead.
There's a brilliant book, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's called Torn Music, which is a reference to Torn Curtain, the Hitchcock film that Bernard Herrmann completely scored, and Hitchcock threw a wobbly and chucked him off the film, and rejected the score. And it's a thick volume all about rejected film scores, and the same stories come back again and again and again and again. You know, test screening, audience, the film didn't sing, didn't work. Someone's commissioned to write a new score with kind of 10 days to go before opening night. You know, and quite often films end up with a far worse score because some poor sod has been given like 3 days to write the thing.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, yeah, again, I could talk forever about, but this is why, right, a lot of films or TV have a musical supervisor, because they understand it more than the executive producer that wants to change it.
You would hope, and I think, I don't really know how television works as a general rule, except that because television is lower budget than cinema, and because it's now so cheap to set up recordings and to self-produce, essentially, a lot of composers are actually basically running almost like a bedroom industry, and recording instrumentalists themselves, because they're working mostly with synthesized sounds, and quite often involved in mixing the score themselves. Now, I don't think that's a great system either, because I think the process of composing is a completely different process to the one of engineering and the one of producing and certainly the one of mixing. And there are very few people who are experts at all of those things. But so again, it just kind of diminishes the collaborative aspect that would once have been de rigueur for that kind of output. But
I think of George Lucas hiring all these like excellent experts and sort of kind of pushing them until they make the best thing. And John Williams, you know, like, it's hard to imagine somebody dumping John Williams at the last minute and bringing somebody
well,
in.
they wouldn't. Well, he has been, but not recently. But all composers, I mean, it's happened basically to the greatest composers. Amazing. Because it's that kind of industry. I think if you see footage of John Williams working with George Lucas when they're arguing over the final mix, and you've got the sound designer in the room, and you've got, you know, a big number of people, but clearly John Williams is a powerful voice in that room and is always going to be there to argue for what his music needs, because he's the guy who knows that. Very few composers in Hollywood have that kind of power. Very few.
Yeah. Well, we all want a little bit more power, I guess. I'm not sure how much power I could handle. Like, I could be a director, but I don't know about president, for example.
I do. No, I mean, although I think, I know there are different views, but some would argue that recent events have shown that pretty much anyone could be president.
Well, it's a dumb job. I don't think it should exist.
Who is the president at the moment, though? Is it Elon Musk?
It's the still living Joe Biden. The haggard semi-corpse that is Joe Biden.
Who is the puppet master, though? Who's actually going to be making decisions for the next 5 years?
Yeah. So Trump and Project 2025 will be in soon. God help us. I don't think we have time to go into all that today.
I think let's not. I'm not sure I've quite got the will to do that.
But see, in a normal country, that guy would be the head of a party with all its particular abilities to manage them or not.
Or
But
not.
a president is the closest thing to a dictator outside of, I
Well,
don't know, a
dictatorship.
dictator, a king. So yes, let's get into speculative fiction. How'd you get into it? What was your first foray?
Oh. Well, I suppose it slightly comes back to Doctor Who, because one of the things that I've always said about Doctor Who is that it's an amazing gateway to a world of extended fiction and music and philosophy, because of the number of people who've worked on it and the wealth of talented writers who've contributed to it. So it's through Doctor Who that I got into David Bowie. It's through Doctor Who that I got into Kate Bush. It's through Doctor Who that I got into Hammer Horror. It's through Doctor Who that I got into Douglas Adams. And these are all things that are kind of in a sideways way. They're either referenced in it or, Douglas Adams obviously script edited Doctor Who, so there's an obvious link. It's through Doctor Who that I first got into Stravinsky's music, because I read in Doctor Who magazine that Mark Ayres had based his score for The Curse of Fenric on Russian music from the early 20th century, in particular The Firebird and The Rite of Spring. Some people would say that's a stupid reason to get into Stravinsky and not the kind of thing that someone who has a degree in music ought to admit to. I think it's a fantastic thing that this television program, this silly, eccentric television program, can be so enriching, and that a young me could be introduced to, arguably the most important composer of the 20th century through it, in the same way that you might be interested to explore Buddhism or, the work of George Louis Borcheth. There are so many kind of links and patterns, and a key text when I was a teenager was a book called The Discontinuity Guide. I don't know if you've come across that.
I hear y'all in the Doctor Who fan space talk about it all the time. I have yet to read any Doctor Who nonfiction. So I haven't yet experienced the wonder that you all get in your voices when you talk about it.
It's kind of it's of its time. And we did a hamster podcast about it a little while ago, and I think we felt that it was very much a book of the 90s, but it was quite a crucial text because it was the first factual Doctor Who book to not take the programme too seriously. At a time when fans had a tendency to take things a little too seriously, it was able to laugh at the show affectionately. But crucially, every story is listed, and one of the sections it has is called Roots, and it provides a list of often very tenuous roots for the story in question. And those lists open my eyes to a hell of a lot of stuff. So you read in The Seeds of Doom that it's inspired by an Avengers episode called The Man-Eater of Surrey Green. So when The Man-Eater of Surrey Green came on to Channel 4 late night when I was a impressionable 15-year-old, I recorded it, watched it, and have been a huge fan of the Avengers ever since. And for those not quite sure what I'm talking about, I don't mean the Avengers as in the Marvel universe of PVC-wearing superheroes. I mean the very British institution from the 1960s, which is a man in a bowler hat called John Steed and his very sexy partner, played by Diana Rigg, called Emma Peel, who used to solve crimes and save the world, always whilst looking fabulous and drinking a lot of champagne.
Yeah,
so
I got to get.
So that's a long way of saying.
It sounds great.
Oh, it's fantastic! It's so good. So that's a long way of saying basically that kind of Doctor Who was a gateway drug to all kinds of things, and I guess speculative fiction features quite heavily in that list. And then, as I did also used to like reading sci-fi. There was an author called Nicholas Fisk, who wrote. I guess he was kind of like a John Wyndham, but for kids, and he wrote some quite disturbing stuff and some really intriguing stuff, and his books were very appealingly repackaged in the 80s with these beautiful covers. They don't seem to be as available now, but they were on every kind of children's library bookshelf in the day. And so from there I went on to read John Wyndham. As I said, Douglas Adams, big figure in my teenage years. And yeah, I was always an avid reader anyway. So I was kind of absorbing everything. I guess I wasn't really thinking about what kind of genre it fit into. It wouldn't have occurred to me that speculative fiction was a thing linking it all. But I was definitely aware that I was drawn particularly towards more science fiction-y kind of tomes.
Yeah, it sounds like you were pretty young. Like when we got it over here, it was on PBS late at night.
Yeah.
Like with people doing a telethon every so often. It was really annoying. Some people would tape it off the TV and have it on VHS, and some enterprising people even sat there stopping the tape when the telethon started and starting it again. Like, oh man,
Well,
people went to a lot of work over here in the States.
though the irony is that I didn't really start watching Doctor Who until it was literally just about to be taken off the air.
Whoa.
For what seemed like forever. I became a fan in 1988. It was running at the time at 7:30 or 7 o'clock on Wednesdays opposite Coronation Street, which is one of the UK's biggest soap operas. And my parents were Coronation Street viewers, and we didn't have a video recorder. So I couldn't watch Doctor Who. I'd got into it because I'd been shown it at a friend's house. And ironically, for all that I became a huge Doctor Who fan, I wasn't really watching it until we got a video recorder 3 stories before it was cancelled.
Wow.
So the result is my first experience of Doctor Who, and a lot of people will tell you this, was through books. So it comes back to the kind of love of reading, and an awful lot of people will say that their first reading experiences were the target range of Doctor Who novelizations.
I'm trying to think what my first one was, because I didn't get into the extended lore until very recently. I think my first one was probably Daleks, Doctor Who and the Daleks.
Well, so the first ever Dalek story.
Yeah.
That was one of the first books written, and it wasn't even written for the target range. David Whittaker novelized it for I think they published 3 books way back at the, when Hartnell was still the Doctor. And I don't think they sold okay, but I don't think they really took off. Because they did the Crusades and they did Doctor Who and the Zarbi. So those 3 books
Yes.
were the ones that the Target, when it was a fledgling company, bought the rights to those 3 books. So they were the first books in the Target range.
So that must be why the start of Daleks isn't like Unearthly Child.
Exactly. It's got that wonderfully atmospheric opening where Ian Chesterton stumbles across a car accident in this.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think where it's set. It's a beautiful bit of writing, and it does the establishing in a completely different way to the actual first episode of Doctor Who.
So fast forward, it sounds like Doctor Who was always your main fascination. Were there any other sort of books or franchises that you got deep into?
Well, yeah, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was one that, particularly, that started out as a radio series, and I'm trying to think which birthday it was. I was either 13 or 14 when I got given the 2 original radio series on cassette tape, and it was a box set. It was very sexy. They were all in shiny. When an object kind of your spine tingles just remembering kind of what this thing looked like and discovering the radio series, having already read a couple of the books. That was really exciting.
I just recently listened to all those, and it's such a different experience to the like TV movie and the books.
Oh yeah, well, very different experience to the movie. And the TV series was it's a funny one, isn't it? Because the TV series was made at a time when they just couldn't achieve. There were these big visual ideas that were deliberately kind of written for the radio because you almost had to imagine them. You know, they were always lumbered with Zaphod Beeblebrox's second head because that's a one-liner. You know, it's a joke rather than a thing you want to saddle an actor with for a whole series.
Yeah, and I think it was fully functional in the books, whereas it was a real nightmare in the show.
Well, yeah, so they didn't have, again, the technology wasn't there, so this animatronic head didn't really do much, sort of lolled around.
Did you freak out when you saw that the pig at the restaurant at the end of the universe was a Doctor Who doctor, Peter Davison?
I didn't really, because I think I'd read... I came to the TV series quite late on. I didn't see it when it was originally broadcast, so I think I knew about it before the event. And it's just one of these odd things, like even like Peter Davison and Sandra Dickinson. That's an odd thing, isn't it? What an odd couple. Don't you think? How did that ever work? They just seem like completely different personalities. So the whole thing is a bit bonkers.
Were they married?
They were married briefly. Yeah, well, yeah, they were married in real life. Yeah, so the reason Peter Davison is in Hitchhikers is because he was on set.
Oh.
And he asked to be in it. And
that's amazing.
I can't remember exactly the sequence of events, but someone said, well, he could play the dish of the day. And I think the director said, we can't cast Peter Davison, because Peter Davison was huge at the time.
Yes.
He can't be the dish of the day. But Peter Davison was very happy to do it.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide, the dish of the day is a genetically engineered livestock that wants to be eaten.
So the dish of the day comes over and starts recommending different parts of its body. I think you'll find that my thigh is very tender.
Oh, shit. And if we bring it up to the current day,
yeah,
where do you sit in terms of fandom now?
I happily sit slightly to the side of it and very happily participate. I mean, the Hamster podcasts have been a joy because it's always wonderful to discuss. I do think, like, there's a thing about being into Doctor Who, and other fandoms have this as well. Like, there is an obsession with lists and dates and production and serial codes and different people have different angles. I mean, it absolutely interlocks with my career as a composer, because that's the other thing is I started listening out for the music, and because I was discovering Doctor Who on video mostly, because I was discovering it all after the series had been cancelled, I was discovering it in the wrong order, which is maybe the best way to really have the differences of the different eras highlighted to you, and certainly the different approaches from the composers made very, very obvious. And I was taking this all in because music had become a thing that was definitely one of my things, a thing that I was very interested in. And the joy of being able to spot a Dudley Simpson score, or to go, oh, this is Dudley Simpson writing in a different way to the kind of standard Dudley Simpson sound that evolved by the kind of his main stretch on the Tom Baker stories. You know, you listen to Dudley Simpson in the Hartnell years, or in the kind of early Pertwee stories, it's a completely different sound. So that's really interesting. How did that journey happen? And then you compare it to the Paddy Kingslands and the Mark Ayrses, the Keff McCullochs. I started taping. I made my own soundtrack cassettes, basically from the bits of the stories that had no talking in. So I'd queue up the video for a bit of the story that had some action, and I'd make my cassette recording of that bit, and I'd sort of do a very clumsy edit of whatever musical bits I could find that had little enough talking or sound over them that I could actually listen to them as music. So I learned.
It's tremendous. If I could just jump in really quick. I love these moments when we find out, like, where we started with, like, production, you know, like like that's something a radio person might get a job to do or whatever, like cut together sound, or an archivist. So we're looking back from our adulthood or whatever, and like I wanted to be a talk show host like Conan O'Brien, and then I sort of do that now. It's fun to look back at these first moments.
The thing about
And you made them off the VHS. Did you just have like a mic to the TV, or did you have an output?
I mean, it's so unsophisticated. Kids today don't know how easy they've got it with this digital technology that just does it. Yeah, I had the best tape recorder in our house was in our living room, so I had to do this when I got home from school before my parents got back from work. So I had a window of about an hour and a microphone plugged in to the tape recorder, which I'd stretch across. The tape recorder was in the corner of the room. The television was in the other corner of the room. So I'd stretch this microphone lead as far as it would go. I worked out exactly where you could put the microphone to get the best possible sound. But yeah, it's an off-air recording, basically. I think later on I realized that you could actually plug a cable in directly to the back of the television and get a better sound that way. So it evolved. And then as to the editing, I mean, it was just sort of precision, pressing pause in exactly the right place and then queuing up the next thing that I'd worked out would be in roughly the same kind of key or tempo, and I could do a kind of transition that way, but very clumsy.
Did you take handwritten notes or like make a spreadsheet before you started?
Did used to do timings, yeah. and I would come up with titles for all the tracks and stuff. I guess you learn your craft, don't you? I mean, later I got into filming. I was always kind of interested in filmmaking, and again, it's just talking a camcorder. You know, the digital editing equipment that you can do it on your phone now. We didn't have any of that, and I could do an edit because I could, as I was editing onto video. So again, with the sound, I'd be stretching. I'd have composed my underscore because I'd learned that from watching from observing the way the underscore worked. I learned how to write music for films, basically. So I'd have written my film music. That would be in a cassette, or later, when things got more sophisticated, a mini disc player. That would be all queued. Yeah, remember those days?
Oh,
that would be all queued up, and I would need to press play on the camcorder, unpause the video, which I'd worked out took 2.5 seconds to unpause. So I'd need to unpause it 2.5 seconds before I wanted the cut to be. Then I would press play on the mini disc player, and the music would be plugged into one channel of the input. So the music was coming out from one speaker and the dialogue from the other. That's all we had in those days. That was the only way of doing it. And mixing it that way. So the best way of editing was actually to edit in camera, because the more edits you had to do, the more dodgy it became, because you were always reliant on that 2.5 seconds being absolutely accurate. So much better, if you could, to edit in camera, which is how I learned to edit.
That's amazing. And that goes all the way back to 1963, when they couldn't afford to make more than 2 or 3 edits per episode. Yeah. And so they would just let Hartnell say all kinds of fucked up lines just to keep moving.
Yeah, or even kind of before that. I mean, the early Avengers stories went out live.
Oh, my God.
But that's thrilling to watch. I mean, there are some... so the lead in the Avengers is an actor called Patrick McNee, who played John Steed. One of his great skills was keeping scenes going when other actors around him had forgotten their lines or lost track of where they were. He ad-libs beautifully, and sometimes he just lightly makes a joke out of a slightly wrong line or a misremembered cue. But that's obviously a skill that's pretty much dead, because it's a different skill to theatre. Even it would have been
honed in theatre, or on the radio.
It's what do you do with a thing that's maybe been rehearsed for a week? I think they probably had about 5 days of rehearsal. The cameras are on you. You've got to keep the thing going, and what do you do? How do you get out of those situations? Sorry, we've gone really. That's quite a digression from
we
speculative
just have
fiction.
Too much to talk about. Let's get into it. Now, what drew you to the Bartimaeus Trilogy?
Right.
What got you into, who's the author again?
So it's Jonathan Stroud, or possibly Stroud. I was going to check, and then I thought, do you know what? I feel like the internet is not. It's not a place for hard facts anymore, is it? I mean,
oh my God, I feel like I complain about it 3 times a day now.
I almost quite love it. I mean, I don't love it because clearly it's a major problem.
Have you switched to a different search engine yet? I've switched to
I'm not sure I bother anymore.
DuckDuckGo.
But it's all AI now. I mean, the thing that we're learning, of course, is that AI will confidently spew out absolute nonsense. So whereas we had a brief period where people would look stuff up and get a fairly kind of definitive answer on factual information, now you're just as likely to get nonsense that is going to be repeated as fact. So why I'm not going to place on the internet a definitive reading of the surname of this author, because we could have a much more exciting time imagining the different ways it could be. And if I looked it
Jonathan
up,
Stroud.
Stroud. You can pronounce that. It's a thorny issue anyway, because Stroud is a very picturesque town in the Cotswolds, and it is called Stroud by everyone apart from the people who actually live in it. And even then, I think a lot of the people who live in it now call it Stroud, but I think the historical pronunciation is Stroud, which is the correct local pronunciation. So I don't know, what is it, Jonathan Stroud or Jonathan Stroud? Anyway, that's
if you're one of Jonathan's people, check in.
Yeah, apologies if well, I'm not apologizing, because if I'd looked it up,
it might have been wrong.
that last 3 minutes of podcast, which I think, by the way, were absolute gold. We wouldn't have had any of that, would we?
That's a very important message to give the viewer, the listener, the reader. Oh, everything you're hearing is wonderful and excellent, and couldn't be done any other way.
So I came across this book through a colleague of mine. So I mentioned that I'm a teacher. I work with 8 to 13-year-olds. So I have made a point of doing quite a lot of reading of literature written for that age group, partly because it is a boarding school. So one of the things I'm constantly confronted with is an 11-year-old saying, I haven't got anything to read. And quite often what they mean is, can I read my football magazine? But they are meant to be reading, a book. And fortunately, we've got a very well-stocked library, and I've been reading what's in it so I can go, well, I think you'd really enjoy this book here, and I can place it into their hands. And my colleague, Chloe, who is one of the teachers in the school and very well read herself and really into all kinds of literature, but again, reads a lot of children's books because of where we work, bought me this book for Christmas one year. And she bought it for me because she loved it. Isn't that, I mean, that's...
I feel like that's the best gift.
It's the best gift, isn't it? That's, I mean, I'm now constantly buying people books for presents as by default, and it's usually kind of, I've read this and loved it recently, or it's, I read this when I was your age. I've got nieces, and I just think it's one of the ways of showing someone you love them and respect them is to say, here's a thing that I love, and you're taking a risk always, because you're saying, here's a part of me, and I really hope you like it as well.
Every Doctor Who fan knows this feeling.
Absolutely. And the dreadful feeling of realizing that your favorite program doesn't look quite so shiny to everyone. This book, however, I remember opening it just after Christmas, it would have been, and straight away falling in love with the prose and falling in love with the world. And so it's the first in a trilogy of books featuring this character Bartimaeus, about whom more in a moment. But just to contextualize a bit more, Jonathan Stroud, this trilogy of books already existed when I got into his writing. He has since gone on to write, I think, a commercially more successful series called Lockwood & Co., which was recently turned into a really good Netflix series that didn't get recommissioned, tragically, because it was so good. But if you have Netflix, I would absolutely check that out. And there are 5 books in that sequence. They are written slightly more for younger readers. I would say the Lockwood books are a great read for either a well-read 10 or 11-year-old, or certainly kind of 12 and above. They're very easy reads. The writing's slightly bigger than the ones in the Bartimaeus books. And he's currently working on a series about the notorious Scarlet and Brown, which is a kind of dystopian future meets Western with an element of fantasy in it. And they're brilliant as well. I mean, I'm really loving all of his writing. And he has a way of...
Wait, that sounds a lot like The Dark Tower. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
it's like dystopian Western with fantasy.
Yeah, but his protagonists are always children. I mean, the gimmick in Lockwood and Co. I call it a gimmick. I mean, the MacGuffin is that it's an alternate reality where ghosts have been a problem. Like, it's talked of as the problem. A recent problem. Ghosts have just started appearing, and they're lethal. And the only people who can see them are children. So you actually need qualified teams of children.
You need trained child soldiers.
Basically child soldiers, which are managed by, the thing that Jonathan Stroud gets so right every time is he manages to kind of ground everything in what would happen if only children could see ghosts. Well, clearly people would make a heck of a lot of money out of it, and you'd have these big corporations managing the children and training the children, exploiting the children. The joyous thing about Lockwood is that Lockwood has inherited his own business of his parents, and so the children are running the show. And so
nice.
They're not respected by any of the contemporaries, and they're struggling with kind of the adult problems of, managing the business and all of the concerns that would normally be taken on by the corporate people running the show, at the same time as risking their lives every night to try and deal with the problem. They're wonderful books. They're so cleverly written. And the thing that the thread that runs through all of his writing is a very deft juggling of real jeopardy and quite dark themes, really, with very well-rounded, well-written, and funny characters. And he writes very funny prose.
That's great. I'll definitely check that out. I mean, the comedy in the Bartimaeus books is so good. We've got this super dry ancient guy that is just always kind of busting on humans. And then you've got the ridiculous things that humans do to each other. Yeah. And you've got those weird power dynamics where people, wizards, like, are manipulating and exploiting the djinn. And even though they're more powerful, it's got a lot of opportunities for comedy.
It's quite a... It's comedy, but also it's quite a complex world from the off, isn't it? Because it's very efficient writing. I picked this book. I haven't read this book since it was first bought for me, and I picked it up to prepare for this podcast, and it was like falling into a warm bath or meeting up with an old friend. It was just straight away. I thought, I remember why I loved this so much. And it's the efficiency of the world building, apart from anything else. So in this world, it takes place in a London that's totally recognisable. It all takes place in Whitehall, and the bit of London that I know well because it's where I work. But magicians are the ones who wield the most power. Therefore, the politicians are the magicians. And
that's a great idea.
It's a great idea, isn't it? But also the idea that magic is so central to everything that, again, he's thought, well, what would it look like then? And what it looks like is these really high stakes power battles at the top of the tree where it's really kind of whoever's the most powerful magician is going to wield the most political power. But the next strata down, it's the shops are selling magic wands, and it's a little bit like the real London now, which has seen a absolute plague of Harry Potter themed magic shops, which I think are probably mostly covers for money laundering, but they are kind of like these tacky little stalls selling trinkets and magic, like the kind of New Age shops. And Bartimaeus is very sneering about these because he's saying, there's very little genuine magic there, but it's the focus. Of course there would be real dangerous magic, and then the next level down there'd be people buying gemstones because someone's saying, yeah, that'll keep you safe.
Yeah, there's this great bit where he's like, some people buy these little charms that do nothing, but they are useful in that they tell anyone in the magical world that you're not a part of it, so you'll be safer. It almost feels like magic is code for like organized crime.
Yeah.
If you're not a part of it, you probably won't be affected. Other than it controlling your macro live society and all that.
But it's very clear from the off that it's a completely unscrupulous business. Like it's all to do with who holds the most power, and people will do anything to get into that situation, which is not so very far from the realities of politics.
It's so upsetting. I love when in children's works like Roald Dahl, they just have adults behaving the way our leaders behave, and it's shocking to us because they're doing it in front of kids. Normally we hide that shit behind closed doors.
Yeah. There's also an element that's very British about this, I think, which is that I think, although we've experienced similar problems in the upper echelons of our political class, the thing that is slightly different about the discourse is that for some bizarre reason, kind of the pretense of gentility is still prized above all else here. So there's a real issue with kind of absolute ratbags and the most kind of unscrupulous people who dress quite well and talk very nicely. And there's a certain we still in this country have a kind of deference to a natural. It's like a natural serfdom. As soon as someone's wearing a nice suit, exactly, we look up to them because they talk nice. We're still weirdly driven by class here in a way that I don't think is quite the case in America.
We aren't immune. It's just slightly different. Like even me, I am anti-monarchist, anti-everythingist mostly. And yet when I watch Father Brown and see Lady Felicia, I'm like, oh man, she's great. And it's like, yeah, she just talks real good, looks nice, has nice outfits, is married to an aristocrat. It doesn't make her like more human, but there's this, I don't know, weird sort of pull, this class thing. Democrats have it here with like political leaders, like the Obamas or Jill Biden and her fancy necklaces or whatever. Plus the celebrity worship, but that's much more vulgar, I find, in general.
Yeah. It's funny that, it depends how you define vulgarity, because, Boris Johnson's a great example of he's like a stupid person's idea of a clever person. Because he'll come out with some bullshit Latin, and people are impressed by that, but it's like, okay, but if you scratch the surface, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's just a really expert bullshitter, which doesn't make him clever. It makes him not stupid necessarily, but it doesn't make him clever. It doesn't make him the person you want making the decisions for the country. You don't want someone like that managing a global pandemic. That is the worst kind of person. Someone who thinks that bullshitting their way through something is going to get them to the other side. And so what resonates in Bartimaeus is that the magicians are so. These very, very powerful, dangerous people are so polite to each other, to their faces, but would stab each other in the back metaphorically because they would get someone else to do it for them and use some magic.
Right.
But,
yeah.
They are highly dangerous and highly competitive and not to be trusted at all, but the face of it is genteel and polite and well dressed. That really kind of rings true of the politics as an alternate version of what we are living in now. That makes total sense to me.
Yes, and unlike your standard child hero, what am I trying to say? Narrative. Nathaniel in this book isn't even our point of view character at the beginning. He represents all of that shit in its nascent like form. You know, he's been a wizard in training for 6 years or something, but he's not any more, what's the word, like doe-eyed or naive or good. You know,
no, in fact he's it's made very clear early on that he's damaged.
Yeah.
The system that's described, we get the impression that what's going on is some kind of apprenticeship scheme. It's not clear in the opening chapters when this started or exactly what the relationship is between Nathaniel and his master, the person who has instructed him in magic. But the first scene in which we see things, so narratively it's structured in quite an interesting way. A lot of it's first person, narrated by Bartimaeus in this very dry, humorous way. But then it alternates, and there are chapters headed Nathaniel, and it's third person, and we suddenly glimpse a scene of him as a 6-year-old going through a terrifying experience, which has been set up by his master to teach him a lesson. But straight away we can see that this is a child who at the age of 6 has been horribly scarred by this experience.
Yes, this is the thing that comes up in the Dresden Files, is like, how early do you scare the hell out of your wizards?
Yeah.
How early do you teach them that morality is just not relevant when it comes to lightning bolts and demons and and a lot of these masters in fiction just fuck them up real early.
Yeah. Yes. And it's a scary scene. Did you think? I mean, the way it's described, there's a moment where he puts on the special pair of glasses that are going to allow him to see the demons in the room.
And they're everywhere.
Which is fundamental. I mean, so just, again, background for those of you not familiar with the book. The demons are the source of the magic. Okay, so the more powerful a demon you can command, the greater your magic's going to be. And Bartimaeus is a kind of mid-level. I'd love this as well. The world building of the other plane is very thorough too. That there are different types of demon, different powers of demon. And Bartimaeus is a djinn, which places him sort of in the middle rank, but he's
powerful, but not city-destroying powerful.
But the ability to control demons is key to magical success. And in this scene of Nathaniel's training, he puts on these glasses and realizes the room is absolutely full of demons. And it's a very, very scary image. I mean, the potency of the writing is part of it, but it really does. It made me feel really uncomfortable reading that chapter, because you are basically reading about a kind of abuse.
Right, yes. And I reread it 3 or 4 times in prep for this, and I remember how I felt when Dolores Umbridge was torturing Harry in their one-on-one sessions in Order of the Phoenix, I think the 5th book, I think is that one. And I remember like throwing the book down. This was the first Harry Potter book I read. I threw it down and I was like, this is fucked up. No teacher ever is allowed to behave this way. And I'm like, yeah, but they're British. And I'm like, no, that's 30 years old at least. Like, that's not modern. But I had to keep reminding myself, she's horrifying you on purpose, so you get that this is a villain. Now, I don't want to celebrate J.K. Rowling, so we'll focus on this bit. But it's like, it's preparing you to understand that this book is not pulling punches. It's not playing games. Like,
yeah, I
suppose there are very serious consequences for our hero.
Again, there is a a British angle on this, and I think, one thing. I'm not a massive fan of J.K. Rowling's writing, but I do think that she understands the British public school system. And one thing that is true is that whilst I think that generally we're now kind of on top of safeguarding in a way that means that certain practices don't happen anymore, the public school system has perhaps been sheltered from too much scrutiny because of its particular status, because of its fee-paying nature, because for a long time parents sent their children to these schools and paid lots of money with the expectation that the school would know how best to deal with their offspring. And historically, public schools felt the best way to deal with it was to run things as a kind of boot camp, and to have very harsh punishments and a kind of accepted system of institutionalized bullying as well, because that's how you grow character and that's how you make people strong. I refer you again to some of our recent leaders in the UK, and you can make up your own minds as to how successful you think that system has been.
Yeah, for Americans, public school means the opposite here.
Yeah, right. So public schools in the UK are private schools.
So, like, our view of that typically, especially more recently, you mentioned boot camp. It was these special schools for bad kids, or like kids that were too naughty or autistic or whatever for one private school. That summertime they'd send them to this evil school. And so every once in a while we get movies or TV episodes like The New Quantum Leap did this, where they show that stuff happening to another group of kids. So I think it's hard for a lot of people who haven't been traumatized by their teachers or caregivers or whatever, that it just happens where it happens, to even to rich kids, and like very little is done about it, unless there's strict oversight. If the parents are like keeping an eye on things, if people do bad things, they'll be punished. But I mean, the Catholic school system, we know it all went down, and it still happens in pockets. But it's always shocking to me when I see it.
Well, or arts institutions. I think there's certainly an area of higher education where the safeguarding has got a lot of catching up to do. Have you seen Whiplash?
I've avoided it because it sounds like bullying, right? I had a lot of that.
100% bullying. It's an astonishing film, though. It's an exhilarating watch. And there's a scene towards the end where he talks about his methods, and he kind of justifies his bullying, his unjustifiable bullying, but he justifies it so articulately that you almost buy it. It's really interesting because I think that in music schools, theatre training, I think it probably there is still a kind of an old school approach which is fairly unreformed, and it's we've been very good over recent decades of dealing with abuses in the system that affect very young children and teenagers. Maybe we need to give some attention now to the ones who have left school and are still basically children.
Wow. Yeah. It's a lot of times they'll justify it because it's tough competition and we have to weed out the weaklings. I think that's kind of what's happening here.
Oh yeah, this again is why it resonates, because I think you would. You're justifying it by saying the only way this magician is going to survive in this horrific world, this horrific backstabbing world, is to be confronted with the realities of that from day one. They need to know how dangerous the thing is. They need to know how threatened they are by the power they are harnessing and by the others who have that power.
All right. Well, as we get into the chronology, keep those themes in mind. We start with Bartimaeus. He's coming into form in the corporeal realm. Excuse me. Quote, "The sulfur cloud contracted into a thick column of smoke that vomited forth thin tendrils. They licked the air like tongues before withdrawing. The column hung above the middle of the pentacle, bubbling ever upward against the ceiling like the cloud of an erupting volcano. There was a barely perceptible pause. Then two yellow staring eyes materialized in the heart of the smoke. Hey, it was his first time. I wanted to scare him."
Don't you love that?
Love it. Love it. So the kid, he's just called the kid early because the demon doesn't know his name. We'll find out why that's important as we go along. But so he's making sure it's the right demon. I assume this is standard procedure. "Are you that Bartimaeus who in olden times was summoned by the magicians to repair the walls of Prague?" What a time waster this kid was. Who else would it be? I upped the volume a bit on this one. "I am Bartimaeus. I am Sakralgini, Negorso the Mighty, and the Serpent of Silver Plumes. I have rebuilt the walls of Uruk, Karnak, and Prague. I have spoken with Solomon. I have run with the buffalo fathers of the plains. I have watched over old Zimbabwe till the stones fell and the jackals fed on its people. I am Bartimaeus." And this kid somehow manages to keep his urine in his bladder. That would scare the hell out of me.
It's joyous hearing Bartimaeus big himself up as well, and
Yes.
this is how scary I was.
Yeah, he says most young magicians are cautious, and this kid is punching above his weight. I'm paraphrasing, but that's generally the vibe.
It's a great setup because we don't know anything about this kid at this point, but it sets up this conflict, which is it's made very clear straight off that the kid is punching above his weight unwisely.
Mm-hmm.
The danger to the kid is made clear because Bartimaeus is already talking about, the minute I have my chance, I'm going to get my revenge on this scrawny thing. And it's also made clear that the reason for the kids summoning him is, it would appear, completely insane.
Yes. I like that you mentioned like the economy of world building.
Yeah.
By telling us he's done all this stuff, he's telling us, one, that like jinns exist and they've been around forever, but also that magicians have been a part of it, right? Because he was summoned to repair the walls of Prague. So this world might have magicians going thousands of years back.
Yeah, that's very much implied, and we don't find out much about Bartimaeus' past, but it's hinted that he has spent more time in the Middle East and actually would prefer to be in a warmer climate. Mm-hmm. He occasionally takes the form of an Indian boy who he says nothing about, but he says it's the form of someone he loved once.
Yes.
So someone who he has served in the past, he has formed affection for, which is so intriguing because he's so dismissive of human beings.
After we've seen him just talking shit about us for quite a while, he comes around and just becomes this nice boy that he loved.
The other thing I must mention about the prose is that Bartimaeus, and I love this so much, Bartimaeus uses footnotes.
Yes.
And I just think as a stylistic choice, that's funny, but it means that he can give these asides, which are quite often just funny asides, and sometimes they fill in detail, and it paints him as someone who's fastidious and wanting to explain everything. And again, it's quite often about bigging himself up more. So, for example, there's a bit where he starts talking about he is inspecting different planes, and the footnote says, "I have access to 7 planes, all coexistent. They overlap each other like layers of a crushed Viennetta. 7 planes is sufficient for anybody. those who operate on more are just showing off. Which is lovely, because he's again bigging up his own skills and his own judgment, but also filling in an important detail, because it does become significant that there are these different planes on which the demons operate.
Yes, and it also you don't notice it on the audiobook, but it kind of frees up room on the page for incident, because some of that exposition is in the back. Yeah, him just taking those. It's almost like pop-up video or like the X-ray on Prime. It's like, this is how magic works, and here's another joke about how humans are idiots.
I mean, it appeals to my sort of OCD when it comes to reading. So there are plenty of examples of academic texts where the footnotes are just filling in biographical detail or doing something. The footnotes technically ought to be unimportant. They ought to be stuff that you can skip. But because I'm obsessive when I read, I have to read everything. And generally, my experience of footnotes is, particularly when I have to turn pages to get to the footnote, I was like, well, that was a waste of time, wasn't it? And yet I'll still read them. So I love reading a book where the footnotes are part of the experience, and you feel like you're in this semi-academic text, but each footnote is a little treat.
Yes. On my version, it's like a Kindle version.
So it pops up.
You have to click back because it's on my phone. It's a little more complicated. Whereas Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, they're always at the bottom of the page.
At the bottom of the page. Well, that's what I've got here in the printed version.
Nice. Yeah, that's so easy. Yeah. Oh man, I got to get these books. I have this new rule: if I listen to books more often than once, I got to get them in print, just to have them around the house.
Yeah, that's a good rule.
Let's see. Bartimaeus thinks the kid should be thinking about cars and girls and not summoning demons.
That's great as well, isn't it? Because he talks about, because we could be in a fairly po-faced fantasy world, but straight away he's keen to make it clear that the kids, for all that they're in a version of an alternate version of our reality where magic is king, kids are still the same. They still have posters of pop stars on their walls.
And that also wizards, contrary to what you might think, are actually often quite conventional.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which makes it more like grounded, I think is what you said earlier. Next quote. I charge you to retrieve the Amulet of Samarkand from the house of Simon Lovelace and bring it to me when I summon you at dawn tomorrow. You what? I charge you to retrieve? Yes, I heard what you said. I didn't mean to sound petulant. It just slipped out, and my sepulchral tone slipped a bit too. Oh, man, I love it because it immediately punctures his pomposity. The idea that there's a task that is too much for him, and he knows it, and he does not want to do it. But he's not going to admit that it's too much for him.
But also, he can't refuse. So this is a really interesting dilemma, that he's being asked to do something really difficult. The demon has to obey the magician. That's the rule that's been set up. There are consequences otherwise. And suddenly it's his problem.
Yes. Because he's trying to get more information, the wizard, we find out the wizard has to send them away by saying it 3 times, unless they choose to leave before that.
Yeah.
Which is why he's able to get a few more words in. He thinks that someone is taking advantage of the kid, which I thought was interesting.
That's right. His assumption is that the kid is doing someone's work because no scrawny adolescent would be asking for such a huge task.
Yeah, which I don't think in these first 6 chapters we learn whether that's yes or no.
No, we don't.
Nothing's confirmed.
We don't find out very much about Nathaniel at all, really.
And partly that's because it's all third person with him.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem all that introspective anyway. I'm not sure how much we would learn about him if it was first person.
No, I suppose not. What I like is the way that when we do finally get to the Nathaniel chapter, and it's the flashback to this traumatic experience, it does match the nervous, scrawny, insecure individual that Bartimaeus has described. We're getting a different perspective on him, but it's very clearly the same character.
I love how he's at once gripped by terror, but also courageous enough to do a thing if he's been told to. Like, it really sets up a lot of contrasts within the kid. Let's see. We find out we're in London. It must be close to modern day if Bartimaeus is talking about racing cars. The kid's room is decorated Spartanly. Bartimaeus wonders why there are no posters of pop stars or football players. Then he tells us that the amulet belongs to Simon Lovelace, that he's bad news and he will do anything to get it back. But the kid doesn't care, starts doing something to him called the systemic vice, which as far as we can tell is some sort of spell that'll hurt demons.
I loved it. And then the final sentence of the chapter is, I went. I didn't bother with any more special effects.
Yes. Oh, man. I love how he talks about his own skills. Yeah, special effects.
Yeah.
And also he's at least knows enough about modern day things. I always wonder who summoned him like a week earlier, or, you know, how long has it been since he's come back?
Yeah, it's straight away. It's intriguing, isn't it? Because it's not. We dive straight into this story. We don't know what he was doing a week earlier, and we don't really know what he would be doing if he wasn't doing the bidding of someone who'd summoned him.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like he'd be out watching movies, or like we don't know how he accesses knowledge when he's in the other place. If he's just up to date on stuff, or if he does he have a library card over there?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Where is there? On what plane does he exist when he's not in our world?
Yeah. So he goes on the mission. Chapter 2, we find out he can turn into animals, but it hurts to be corporeal. Changing his form helps, but it also burns up his energy or his ability to maintain his form.
I love the way that that's described as well, as it's all to do with he talks about the limitations of material bodies. He's really describing kind of the reality of being in a body, which comes with aches and pains, and he talks about it as a restricting thing, and wonders how humans can possibly deal with being this way all the time, which I love, because
relatable.
There's a part, it is relatable.
Oh man, that moment when you wake up, as long as you didn't have a shitty dream, and you're like, oh, I'm still spirit. Oh wait, no, there's my toe hurts or whatever. Let's see. He wonders about the kid and what will happen to his own reputation when other demons learn that he's been controlled by this mewling child. He can see on 7 planes. Humans can only see 1. We find out that, he goes to the houses. He goes to the fancy street where the fancy houses are. And we learn that magic protections equal wealth. So I had the question, do people pay mages to set these up? Or are only mages wealthy enough to do it? In terms of these protections. Basically, I'm wondering, are there normal rich people and wizard rich? Or are wizard rich just way richer?
It seems to me that the two slightly go hand in hand, because again, we're talking about a society where magic equals power and power equals money. So it's implied that it's described like a kind of gated community with a lot of security cameras. It just happens that the security cameras are all magical. So there's in the house, there's what is
That
described
toad
basically.
thing?
It's a toad on the ceiling,
Yeah. Let's
but
see.
it's
The
like
house
it's like a camera.
Yeah, the house is well defended. It's got the dome over it, like an alarm dome, and then it's got these three weird-looking sentries that are like legs with a fleshy hub and tons of eyes.
I love that the description is so vague, and because he's already said that he's sensing them on one of the is it the third plane they're on? They're just a dull yellow color, and you can visualize a thing that you wouldn't be able to see unless you could see in different planes, and they are just kind of blobby shapes, kind of indistinct, much more threatening than describing an actual monster.
Yeah, it's weird and unsettling. For some reason I picture it as a Doctor Who kind of monster, like just a really poorly designed thing on a stool the stool's been CSO'd out or something.
I was picturing it more like kind of on an infrared camera when you can, or a heat camera, that kind of image where you can see the shape of something through a wall.
Nice. That's good. So he turns into a mole to go under the alarm shield, and we get to chapter 3, and he starts off talking about why being a mole sucks. That he's a being of fire and air, so he hates being under the earth.
I love the hierarchy. Birds good, insects good, bats okay, things that run fast are fine, tree dwellers are even better, subterranean things not good, moles bad.
He says he ran into 5 pebbles, once each on 5. Oh, this is one of his footnotes.
It's one of the
Once
footnotes.
each on 5 different pebbles, not the same pebble 5 times. Just want to make that clear. Sometimes you human beings are so dense. Let's see. He heard voices inside the house, and he sees a vent, becomes a fly, and flies in there. I don't remember if it's this book or a different one that talks about when you're infiltrating, you want to actually follow the guards or follow the homeowner or whatever, because they'll lead you to the important places. Does that ring a bell?
Vaguely.
It
Yeah,
might
I'm
have
not
been.
sure.
It might have been a different Four Kosagen book or whatever I'm reading. But yeah, that's what he does. He goes and listens in on Loveless and a lady he's presumably dating. They talk about. He's basically talking about the corruption in the political system, and the fly. Bartimaeus tunes it out mostly because it's like, yeah, of course humans are filthy and corrupt. But Loveless comes off as this. I guess this is chapter 4. He comes off as kind of a prat, and the woman is like fawning over him. It's hard to know if she's just playing Simon Loveless or if she's really in love with him.
We don't get a lot of detail on on how she fits in, but she is clearly part of the setup for showing that he's just a rich dickhead, really. Because he spends it's very clear that he talks about himself a great deal and nothing else.
Oh, yes. But also we learn that he's planning a party. It's going to take place at her house.
Oh, yes.
And it's going to impress all these bigwigs.
And that's where we get a hint of the politics driving everything, because there's talk of the Prime Minister, and it's clear that kind of magical power is key to having the ear of the Prime Minister and the government, and the things are all wrapped up.
Yeah, Bartimaeus thinks about turning into the lady next time he sees the kid to try to make him uncomfortable because he's a kid.
Do you know what this reminds me a little bit of?
Uh-huh.
Do you know The Box of Delights?
No.
So, The Box of Delights is a classic children's book by John Masefield. Certainly at least 60, maybe 70 years old. I don't think his books have aged terribly well. I think they're kind of incoherent and really badly structured. But because The Box of Delights is this beloved text, it was adapted for radio several times, and then there was a landmark BBC adaptation in the 80s when I was a very young viewer. It gave me nightmares, and it's now kind of essential Christmas viewing. And it's got Patrick Troughton in it in one of his last roles. It's one of the kind of family shows that the BBC chucks everything at, and how you receive it will depend on how you feel about really dated special effects, because of course they threw a lot of special effects at it and they have all dated. But it's got some beautiful performances in it. It's got a wonderful atmosphere. It's got some crossover with Doctor Who because it's got a score by Roger Lim, and it's got Patrick Troughton in a fairly key role. And the box is again, not terribly well-defined magical object, but it does give you the power to change size. So this thing of being in a room overhearing conversations between rich people is very much a staple aspect of that drama. And just the imagery there reminded me of that. I would imagine Jonathan Stroud is very familiar with that material because of being a British author. So yeah, hadn't occurred to me before, but
heck yeah, that's cool. So he's a little fly in the vent.
Yeah.
About turning into a woman, he has an endnote. For those who are wondering, I have no difficulty in becoming a woman, nor for that matter a man. In some ways I suppose women are trickier, but I won't go into that now. Woman, man, mole, maggot, they're all the same when all's said and done, except for slight variations in cognitive ability. I mean, he's not wrong, but it is kind of rude.
I love that he doesn't go any further, though. He doesn't explain whose cognitive ability he's being rude
Yes,
about.
it could be the maggot for all we know.
Yeah.
They might have rich fantasy lives. Let's see. Lovelace has an imp on his shoulder. That's why he can't enter the room right away.
Love this as well. So when he talks about changing into a woman, he says, I would appear in her guise tomorrow when I went back to visit that kid. Only naked. Let's see how his very steely but ever so adolescent mind responded to that.
I wrote a note about that, which is, I'm not sure how we'd see this happen on screen. It's kind of an 80s or 90s.
It's very much, yeah, no, in the 80s that would have been fine.
That would have killed. Weird science.
Yeah.
Bartimaeus clearly hates ordinary human behavior. The magician was talking. He did little else. The woman gazed at him with spaniel eyes so wide and silly with adoration that I wanted to bite her. And her name is Amanda. So now we learn that there's a prime minister and some sycophants. Made me wonder if there's a king or queen, a House of Commons. How similar to Earth's is this government? I guess our modern
I think
British
even
government.
the decision to use the title Prime Minister is a statement. It's, this is, we're grounding this fantasy in something that you recognize.
Yeah. So there could be a king if
There could be, yeah.
if we needed. So one of his servants comes in. We find out the next thing on his list is going to a play by a friend of his named Makepeace. Lovelace and Amanda will be going to that. So now Bartimaeus considers using magic to, I think once they leave, he wants to find out where to go next. I debated sending out a discreet magical pulse to see if I could detect the whereabouts of the magician's artifacts, but decided that it was far too risky. The sentry creatures outside might pick it up, for one thing, even if there was no further guard. I, the fly, would have to go hunting myself. And this is where we see the toad alarm disguised as a... Was it a toad or a frog?
I think it's a toad, isn't it?
A toad. Okay, for some reason I wrote frog.
Yes,
disguised. Disguised
the two
as
are
a
very
smoke.
similar.
Yeah, disguised as a smoke detector. So this is when I was like, okay, we're definitely in the electronic age. This isn't a period piece.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you've got names like Makepeace and Lovelace, which do have a kind of a 19th century or even a kind of 17th century ring to them. And the trappings of wealth, which are very kind of, it looks like an expensive costume drama, but you've got a smoke alarm, so...
I feel like we're going to run into a Robertson Smythe at one point.
Yes, yeah.
Let's see. He does some good spy work. He follows the mark. He goes to the most well-defended door. And we find out he can turn into smoke. He goes under the door and then turns into the child that you mentioned earlier.
This is all great heist stuff, isn't it? I love the mechanics of how do you actually break into this secret chamber, but with the magic on your side. But the danger is being detective. The more magical he is, the more likely he is to be spotted.
And here's where we learn about him wanting to screw the kid. He wants to turn into the kid so that if he's seen on camera, the kid will be screwed. But he doesn't know his name, so he can't imitate his look. There's some metaphysical thing happening there.
So the importance of names, it goes back to the summoning, because the way that the child was able to summon him was by knowing his name.
Yeah, so he turns into this dark-skinned boy from his past, someone he loved. So demons can love, apparently. Kid was from the Nile, so maybe it was Pharaoh times. That's what I call all those Egyptian eras. So we see this room full of magical bits and bobs, which Bartimaeus scoffs at. They're almost all just low level or not even magical. There's a golem's eye, which is super powerful. He figures Simon Lovelace doesn't know that. Then he says some stuff about magical tourism, about how wizards go all over and take these things. Magical tourism. I ask you. Well, with luck, it might kill him someday. And according to the end note, he doesn't care about cultural vandalism. He just finds it vulgar. So it's not even that he has a moral issue with stealing indigenous people's stuff. I guess if you've seen multiple civilizations crumble, you'd sort of...
A different perspective, wouldn't you?
Yeah. We get a glimpse of the amulet for the first time. The amulet was small, dull, and made of beaten gold. It hung from a short gold chain. In its center was an oval piece of jade. The gold had been pressed with simple notched designs depicting running steeds. Horses were the prized possessions of the people from Central Asia who had made the amulet 3,000 years before and had later buried it in the tomb of one of their princesses. He breaks the glass, he grabs it, and then we learn that something on the seventh plane is coming, and he's had this weird feeling, but he couldn't put his finger on it, and now a portal is opening and something is coming through. He bolts for the door. He hits the door with his little Egyptian boy fist, and it explodes. He deals with the toad. It spits acid. It's burning through the wall. Something called the detonation hits him. He flies into another wall. Jump in whenever you want.
Well, I read this and I thought that, this is difficult stuff to write, actually, because it's all visual, it's all action, and it's again really efficiently described, and it's very exciting. Having had all this tension, and he really does build up this tension of kind of there's something on the seventh plane, we don't know what it is, but it's really clear that he's walking into the lion's den here. Now everything kicks off, and it's really exciting writing.
Yeah, it turns out this guy named Jay Boris just aggressive as hell and is hunting him. The impact was so great that I was sent flying headlong at an angle down the corridor and half into the wall. Green flames licked around me, leaving streaks on the decor like the fingers of a giant hand. Redskin Demon shouts Bartimaeus' name. He rolls down the stairs and looks over at the front door. He sees the sentries out there, so he heads to the back of the house. He comes to a kitchen with an attached greenhouse. He runs in and puts a seal on the door to the hall. And sitting near the fire is who, James?
Well, so by the fire is a cook who has been mentioned earlier. A sort of burly, he's a fat, jovial-looking man with a red face and a meat cleaver in his hand. That's already funny, isn't it? He was studiously paring his nails with the cleaver. I love it.
So badass.
But it turns out that this is not no ordinary cook. He is in fact another demon called Farquhar.
And we learn he and Bartimaeus have history, and he must be strong because Bartimaeus is on his best behavior.
The thing I love about this as well is that Bartimaeus has bragged about his intelligence in not going through the front door, because that's what,
Yes.
that's what they'd expect him to do. And it turns out that he's actually just been deliberately herded to the back of the house.
Oh, so smart. Yeah, this is like if you infiltrate a casino to get the gold, and you get to the vault and the head of security is just sitting there smoking a pipe.
Yeah. And they have a very civilized conversation as well. It's so lovely and understated, isn't it? They greet each other. Bartimaeus? Farquhar? How's it going? Not bad. Haven't seen you around. No, I guess not. Shame, eh? Yes, well, here I am. Here you are indeed. And then he says, while this fascinating conversation was going on...
It's a bunch of detonations are hitting the door.
He's sealed the door, so he's there are things going on behind the door, but his seal is holding firm.
We learn that Jabor must be the red guy with all the detonations. Apparently, he's gotten more addicted to violence over the years. He can't be satisfied. And Bartimaeus says, "Treat 'em mean, keep 'em keen. That's your master's watchword, is it? Still, he must be fairly potent to be able to have you and Jabor as his slaves." Farquhar does not like the S word.
Yeah, we don't use the S word in civilized company.
He says he and Jabor are playing the long game. So that suggests there's a resistance?
Yeah, it's so on in the strata of demons. It's in. Does he actually say what type Farquhar is?
I don't think we learn that until much later. We just assume he's a djinn because he doesn't just immediately step on him and kill him.
I guess so, yeah. But it's clear that this is a well defended house. The master must have particularly fine magical skills to have this many people guarding him. And I like the it's a continuation of Bartimaeus' pretense that he's in charge of his own destiny, when clearly what's going on here is that the demons are absolutely our slaves, but they don't want to lose face in front of each other. So this line about playing the long game, I don't know whether it actually means anything or just it's kind of no, I'm not a slave.
I mean, not having been a slave and not coming from a culture with a long history of it, I can't say how accurate this is to like real life, but it certainly feels like there's a lot under the surface of the ice that, thousands of years of dealing with this that we don't know about. Let's see. Farquhar tells him to give back the amulet. He can't, except for endnote 7. Not strictly correct. I could have given over the amulet and thus failed in my charge. But then, even if I had managed to escape from Farquhar, I would have had to return empty-handed to the pale-faced boy. My failure would have left me at his tender mercy, doubly in his power, and somehow I knew this was not a good idea. There's this Looney Tunes moment where he's trying to edge towards the window.
Yeah.
Farquhar tells him it's silly and pointless. He calls the sentries outside triloids. Bartimaeus pretends to give him the amulet, and then leaps to the side, drops the seal. This detonation shoots through the opening and hurls Farquhar into the fire. Bartimaeus bolts, gets into the garden. The Triloids home in on him, so he makes an illusion, which blinds them because apparently they have tons of eyes. He tears ass through that area and then gets out of the yard. He hits the alarm field as he goes. He hears hooves. I'm imagining the Jinn are turning into horses. So he turns into a peregrine falcon. He takes off across the city with Farquhar and Jabor following. And the end of chapter 4. Suffice it to say, however, that when Farquhar and Jabor landed in the Hampstead back street, creating an invisible obstruction that was immediately hit by a speeding moving van, I was nowhere to be seen. And I was confused by this.
The speeding removal van? Or
I felt like grammar-wise, I couldn't figure out if they created the invisible obstruction, if Bartimaeus did, and what it did to help him escape. I was a little confused there.
I assume that what's meant by that is that Farquhar and Jabor are in pursuit and they've created... they've created an obstruction by leaping into the street, and this speeding removal van has, unable to see them because they're not on the plane that human beings can see. Is total by colliding with these demons.
Gotcha. Okay. So it was just kind of a way of doing a little action, but he was well out of there.
And he's well out of there because he's a peregrine and they can cover 200 kilometers an hour, apparently.
Okay. Chapter 5. This is where we get Nathaniel.
Yeah.
And this is the chapter. This chapter. We find out how bad the kid's master is. Yeah. He's got these huge white eyebrows, which the kid can't ignore. Remember this, he said in a soft voice. Demons are very wicked. They will hurt you if they can. Do you understand this? He doesn't think the kid really gets it. And the kid says, James, you want to do it? Oh, yes, sir. Yes,
yes, sir. Oh, yes, sir. Well, he keeps reiterating. Oh, yes, sir, I do, sir. Demons are wicked and they are hurtful and they will hurt you if you let them, sir. The boy fidgeted anxiously on his cushion. He was eager to prove that he had been listening well.
So it's clear that he's a little younger in this memory, I think, because he's so much more deferential. Although we haven't really seen him with his master yet. He's only seen demons in books. Oh, yeah, at that point I wasn't sure if we were back in time or if he was lying. Master tells him to go to his office, get his spectacles, wear them, and then return. Never having been beyond this point before, he had nothing but nursery stories to furnish his ideas of what might be waiting in his master's study. Terrible images of stuffed crocodiles and bottled eyeballs sprang garishly into his mind. Furiously, he drove them out again. And this was fun because his master just has a normal office, very different from Simon Lovelace with the stuffed crocodiles and the bottled eyeballs or whatever.
Which I guess, we've gleaned from Bartimaeus that the stuffed crocodiles and paraphernalia are just kind of for show and there's no real magical power invested in them. So perhaps Nathaniel's master is the real deal.
That's interesting. So Nathaniel enters the office. It seems ordinary. He sees the box with the spectacles on a table. He heads toward it. He tries to touch it, but it keeps moving. And this is when a bunch of poltergeisty stuff starts happening.
Yeah, so the box, whenever he reaches for the box, it moves and it won't cooperate. And I think at this stage in the book, it still hasn't been spelt out kind of the extent to which magic is controlled by demons, that it's not it's not a human master able to cast a spell on a box to make it move away from someone trying to reach it. There's going to be a thing moving the box. That's the thing. That's the revelation that's on its way.
Yeah, and the kid can't see any of them, so it
Yeah.
looks like telekinesis or a
just the
random
box,
spell or whatever. So he puts on the glasses, and this is a long quote. I wasn't sure how to cut it. There's 100 small demons. So they were stacked one on top of the other all over the room, like seeds in a melon or nuts in a bag, with feet squishing faces and elbows jabbed into bellies. So tightly were they clustered that the very carpet was blocked out. Leering obscenely, they squatted on the desk, hung from the lights and bookcases, and hovered in midair. Some balanced on the protruding noses of others, or were suspended from their limbs. A few had huge bodies with heads the size of oranges. Several displayed the reverse. There were tails and wings and horns and warts and extra hands, mouths, feet, and eyes. There were too many scales and too much hair and other things in impossible places. I mean, he basically went, you can't even do this on TV. Even with CG, it'll never be this good.
No, because it's all about the turn of huge bodies with heads the size of oranges.
Yeah.
It's not even you can't even picture that, can you? I'm just picturing oranges on a huge body, but that is so horrific.
Yes. And so they're all different sizes, like they're everywhere, and they jump him.
But what I love is that they're all frozen because they're trying to persuade the boy that the room is empty. And so you picture these grotesques all kind of playing this game of hide and seek almost. And then they realize that he can see them and they are utterly merciless.
Yes. So they jump him and they don't hurt him, but they menace him terribly for 20 minutes. It was immensely traumatizing, and his master never explained why he did it or even discussed it, and it bred deep resentment in Nathaniel.
The sentence that it's so understated, but this is the more powerful for being understated. For a day and a night he did not eat. For a further week he remained mute and unresponsive. But at length he regained his speech and was able to resume his studies. That's all we get. That's all we're told about a week of not being able to move because he's so traumatized.
Well, and I think nearly all of us remember feeling that at one time, whether it's a car accident or a dog bite or a parent left or whatever the trauma is. Like, that's what it feels like. It just kind of messes you up, but don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah. And then the final sentence in the chapter is, he was 6 years old at the time.
Oh,
God. But it's dark, isn't it?
Yeah. He did not speak of it to anyone, but the shadow of it never left his heart. He was 6 years old at the time. God.
And it comes out of this very zippy, witty first-person prose that we've had up to this point. I think it's the more shocking for being so humorless.
Yeah, absolutely. And then last of the chapters we read for this section, chapter 6, we go back to Bartimaeus. He has the amulet, but it sends out a powerful aura, so anyone aware of magic can follow it to its source. He tells us that basically everything has an aura, but this thing has a mega one. Bartimaeus still has hours to go before he's summoned again, so he has to constantly move from one hideout to the next, including like sewer grates. Like, it gets pretty nasty.
Yeah. And this idea that he has to keep moving because he's holding a really powerful magical object, so he's carrying this alarm around with him.
Yeah, he finds out there's small red spheres moving all over the city, looking for it. There are so many that he had to assume that Lovelace had other magicians assisting with the search. Finally, he gets a little too tired to keep switching and moving, so he goes to Trafalgar Square to blend in with other magic items and people as a way to obscure the amulet's position. This felt like Enemy of the State or
Yeah.
something,
Yes.
where like you have to
Yeah.
hide in plain sight. There's people looking at you. Are they looking at you because they know what you are or what you're up to, or are they maybe want to rob you? Like it was yeah. It was
And
really
it's
interesting.
and it's a lovely thing that he decides after a while that Trafalgar Square is the place to actually just hide himself amongst this hub of human activity where there is some magic as well and just so much going on.
Yeah. So he flies in. He turns into the Egyptian boy again, wearing jeans and a t-shirt this time.
That's a great image as well, isn't it? He's established
Yeah.
this ancient figure of the boy, and then dresses him in kind of contemporary, what would be fairly kind of chavvy clothing, I guess. The sort of clothes that many kids in London would wear.
Yeah, it's easy to see this as a TV series. Like, oh, very contemporary.
Yeah,
Um,
and very
tourists,
visual.
yeah, very visual. There's tourists. They're looking at so-called magical trinkets. They're snapping pictures and so on. Some of these people are magicians. Most of those are from government. One had an imp, but the majority here were without demons. There were a few regular police and some hairy night police, which sounds ominous.
The bit where it's another of the footnotes, but it was the thing that I suddenly kind of he's talking about the different trinkets that are being sold. And he writes, particularly popular were shards of crystal that were purported to exude life-enhancing auras. People hung them around their necks for good luck. The shards had no magical properties whatsoever, but I suppose in one way they did have a protective function. Anybody wearing one immediately advertised themselves as a magical ignoramus, and as a result they were ignored by the many factions of feuding magicians. I just love the idea that these, I mean, particularly as we live in an age where bizarrely there are people buying amulets at great expense to protect them from 5G and hanging them around their neck. I love that even in this magical alternate reality, there are still charlatans selling completely useless things to protect you in a way that's completely meaningless.
If they'd had the magnetic sports bracelets,
Yes.
the $3 water bottles that apparently super oxygenate your blood.
Yeah.
$3, that was 20 years ago. I don't know how much those water bottles are now. 6, 8?
Oh, at least. But this book was this book was first published in 2003, and in many ways it's a little bit prophetic.
Oh my God. 5G. It's like,
Anyway.
I know these people that do this kind of show, they try to keep them relatively evergreen. And I just, the markers of our modern society, I hope they change and someday feel quaint, because they suck real bad right now.
Anyway, I was just tickled by the description of these charms and the connection with the term magical ignoramus, because
Oh yes,
that's great. That is lovely. Yeah. In this world,
so-
you have got the real magicians, and you've got the exploitative charlatans selling stuff, and you've got the people who believe that a thing around their neck is going to keep them safe. And it sort of weirdly does, because it shows that they know nothing.
Yeah, I like that, because if your previous experience with this kind of fiction was Harry Potter, you'll know that there was always this odd tension, which is, how does all this fit in the same world as the rest of us? Here, it's like they're just slightly separate, but they're both at the same market. It's or at least a similar market. It's not too different.
It's the same world. Yeah.
He goes to a stall, but he realizes that a gang of kids are looking at him. He doesn't know why. He tries to mill about and get rid of them. He wonders why they're following him. It can't be to mug him, because he's clearly broke. So he there's this funny part where he stands by a guy that clearly has money and sort of hopes they'll follow that guy instead.
Yeah.
And nope, they keep popping back up.
It's great because we've established that if they were demons disguised as children he would know. So it becomes this quite ominous thing where these kids are definitely following him, and it's not because they want to mug him for his money. So what is it? Who are they? Why are they onto him? It's another source of uncertainty and threat, another mystery.
Yes, I don't want to spoil it, but I will tease it a little bit. The mystery of that lasts for a while into the book. It's fun that Bartimaeus can be clueless in this one way. It's fun to see him slightly on the back foot. I mean, him being chased by bad guys is one thing, but being concerned about a few kids, it's interesting. It suggests that this has never happened before.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is odd for somebody that's been around for thousands of years.
And it's really interesting that having had all these otherworldly threats and the descriptions of dreadful monsters and, the clearly very powerful beings and the detonations, suddenly we're thrown this curveball, which is just some kids, and again, I guess it resonates because everyone can identify with, a situation where a gang of kids has been threatening. And this ought to be a powerful figure who should not care that there are kids following him. And
that's really interesting, because in many ways for a kid, I could see Bartimaeus as being a sort of, what do they call it when it's like, it's not quite self-insert, but it's like identification figure. Like for me as a shorter guy, the Thing or the Incredible Hulk, this big guy you can sort of feel safe inside of. For him to be off balance and concerned is more relatable, and there's that tension there. I like it. He manages to lose them by going into the subway and popping back on the other side of the road. He hunkers down in another alley behind some bins, and he smiles, thinking he's lost them. I allowed myself a brief smile. I thought I'd lost them. I was wrong. Yeah.
It's great. I love also all of this description of dipping into the entrance to the underground, the subways. If you know Trafalgar Square, that's exactly what it's like. It ought to be the easiest place to lose someone because it's got all these roads running off it, and it's got all these subways, and it's got entrances to the underground. And
that's cool. A little local knowledge. Yeah. I always have trouble picturing it.
The one thing that is a little bit intriguing is that Trafalgar Square doesn't have an underground station in real life. So he's planted that, it's very typical in London to have subways combined with entrances to the underground. And he's popped one in here. And I can't remember whether this is something that gets explored later. There's an old underground station near Trafalgar Square called the Strand, and that's a closed underground station, hasn't been in use for decades, but it's used often for films. So when you see the underground in films, because it's still got all of the infrastructure, and still looks like an underground station. It's where they filmed the underground scenes in James Bond a few years ago. They were filmed there, and Captain.
It probably isn't the case, but I'm picturing the underground station in the Invasion of the Dinosaurs, the Doctor Who serial, where there's a pterodactyl down there at one point.
Yeah. That's a studio set, actually. Impressively, it's one thing that Doctor Who was always very good at doing was creating the underground. And the story goes that in The Web of Fear, they asked if they could film on location at the underground, and they were told no. So they built the underground sets in the studio and got a complaint from the authorities saying, "How dare you film in the underground when we told you absolutely not?" And they had to say, "No, they were sets."
That's really fun. Oh man, I love Doctor Who. Okay, well,
it's the kind of thing. Just a slight digression, but locations of underground stations are the kind of thing that kind of for in big movies, they're quite often kind of just put there because it's an iconic London thing. But I think it's the second Thor film where they end up in Greenwich and they come out of an underground station that just doesn't exist. And anyone with local knowledge is like, well, where's that supposed to be though?
That's fun. Yeah, I live near Seattle, and there's so many times I'm like, that's 100 miles away.
Yes.
How'd that get in there? So that is how those chapters end. Obviously, I want to read more. Do you remember the first time you read this? Were you compelled to?
I couldn't put it down. And actually, I only picked this up again a few days ago to prep for this, but again, I couldn't put it down, and I've read further because it's so compelling.
Yeah.
It's so very readable. The prose is really good. I have found that because it's quite wordy. I mean, he really luxuriates in language in this, and Bartimaeus is a creation who is very articulate, and that's part of the joy of it is the quality of the language. But I have found that it therefore is a slightly harder book for children. I've given it to the occasional 12, 13-year-old who has enjoyed it, but they have been advanced readers. I would say generally, like this is probably pitched to a slightly older reader in the way that Jonathan Stroud's more recent books are not.
Interesting.
The Lockwood books are written with simpler language and are much more instantly accessible, I think, for a younger reader.
That's cool. Yeah, I imagine you have a lot of inside knowledge in terms of the kind of language each cohort of kid is more likely to want to read.
I think so. It's sometimes things surprise you. I mean, I find the Harry Potter books actually a real slog in terms of the prose, but kids, and actually that is borne out in the number of kids who actually read those books. But kids who love the material will work their way through it all the same.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there were any. I don't know what the language is on The Hobbit. That was one of the first books I really got into.
I definitely remember finding that a struggle. Whereas I was a C.S. Lewis boy, so I mean I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was pretty young, and that's I think very skillfully written for young readers because it's so efficient and simple, and yet one of the joys of the Narnia books, of course, is that the language evolves with the range, and depending on the story, you've got kind of different levels of complexity. One of the things that makes Prince Caspian a slightly troubling read, apart from the fact that the Narnia you remember is kind of centuries old and crumbling, is that it's written in a more grown-up way.
Speaking of that, have you read C.S. Lewis's other work?
The Out of the Silent Planet trilogy,
like Paralandra,
yeah,
and or Screwtape Letters.
Screwtape Letters is I read that when I was probably too young to really understand it, but that's a phenomenal piece of writing. But that's very wordy.
It has
a really
slight parallels to this because
I was going to say, yeah,
there's a bureaucratic demon in that. Or
it's
devil.
A demon,
yeah.
And a very arrogant demon writing in a florid way. Yeah, no, that's a definite parallel to this. Yeah.
That's fun. Gosh, what else could be said? There's not very many characters, so it's not like I can be like, who's your fave? It's got to be Bartimaeus, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he gets 5 out of 6 chapters.
He does, and it's so compelling. I mean, it's just the voice is so strong. What I remember being very powerful about these books is how invested you become in Nathaniel as well. And don't want to spoil it too much, but clearly Bartimaeus's story is going to be very much intertwined with Nathaniel's, and the way that develops is really interesting. And the way he builds on that in the second and third book in the range is really, really interesting too.
Nice. Yeah. Well, listener, if you enjoyed us talking about these first 50 pages, go out and find this book. It might be at your library. It might be on Libby or Hoopla. If you buy it, go to bookshop.org or audiolibro.fm or other sources where you can support local bookshops. Is there anything like that in Britain where it like gives a portion to a local shop?
Yeah, we have one called Hive that definitely does that. Hive.co.uk, I think it is.
Cool. Yeah, I like to suggest that. But however you get it, talk to us about it. greatandsecretknowledge@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter and, well, I guess all the things at El Jefe Tacoma. That's ELJEFE Tacoma. And yeah, let's have a dialogue. I want to hear how everybody thinks of this book. So it sounds like you might be willing to come back for the next 5 or 6 chapters, James.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, well, I'm definitely going to carry on reading. I can't put it down now.
Excellent. Well, I love this book and I love this series. I can't wait to read Stroud's or Stroid's other stuff.
Let's have a dialogue about that as well. How do you pronounce his name?
Jonathan Stroud. Recommendations. Do you have anything that you've been loving you want to tell people about? Sorry, I just dropped something.
What have I been? Yes, I do have stuff that I've been loving. But you've asked the question, and
it can be as popular or as obscure as you want. It could even be your own podcast, like Dean was on.
I have been loving that. Well, do you know what? Okay, so I have a podcast called Neurotic Literature. That's neurotic, not erotic. You'll get a different podcast if you type that in. Neurotic Literature, and it's short stories which I write myself and I read out, and I'm given to believe that people enjoy listening to them. I think they offer differing experiences. Some of them are slightly creepy, some of them are more kind of outlandishly comic. So yeah, you'll find me there at Neurotic Literature, and I can definitely heartily recommend that. I was going to recommend a film that I saw last Friday called Anora, which is a huge awards contender, I understand. So I think it's a film we're going to be hearing more about. But that's a really fine piece of work, and heartily recommend that.
How do you spell that?
Anora, I think.
Ah, perfect. Well, that sounds good. Is that in theaters or on streaming?
It's on general release in the UK at the moment. I'm sure it must be available in America. I'm not sure what stage we are, but it's fairly art house, so I imagine it will be coming to streaming services near you fairly soon.
Wonderful. I should have prepared for this. I've been reading a lot of Doctor Who books as usual. Podcasts. Let me check my Hoopla. I read some Doctor Who comics that were kind of nice from the library. There was a 15th Doctor one in a shopping mall that I thought was really, really good. What's that one called? Is it just called The 15th Doctor? I think it might be just called The 15th Doctor. Doctor and Ruby. Yeah, it's very good. I feel like people are going to get tired of me recommending Doctor Who every week, but it's just so damn good. Whether it's the books or the audios from Big Finish. There's even some radio things the BBC did, the TV show.
There's a lot of it, isn't there? Yeah.
Oh yeah, so much good stuff. And I guess with recommendations squared away, we can get into our plugs. How do people find you on the internet?
I think my recommendation might have been a plug, actually, disguised as a recommendation.
Perfect.
So, plugs. Well, I have a podcast called Neurotic Literature. You should definitely go and check that out. You'll find me. Well, at the moment, you'll find me on Twitter, which I've thus far clung on, even though various people seem to be exodusing. But I am just to future-proof myself against the exodus. I am also on Blue Sky. On both of those, if you type in James Lark, you'll find me there. And I'm on Instagram under Works of Lark, if you want to follow me there.
Works of Lark. I found the recommendation that I really wanted to remember to do at one point, which was another member of the Ham Fam, Cy Hart, does the Library of Impossible Things.
It's wonderful.
And he's back for season 2 with just so many wonderful episodes.
Which would be your
Rod
favorite
Brown.
episode of season 2?
Oh, God. Rod's was pretty darn good.
Rod's was good.
But they're all so wonderful. Cy's interviewing.
But I'm angling for a kind of. Did you think that mine was?
Oh,
was
you
good?
mean the third episode of season 2? James tells his story.
Yeah.
There we go. Oops, I accidentally turned it on. Let's see. In this episode, Cy welcomes the smart James Lark into the library. Yes, it was tremendous. What was your introduction or your item that you brought? That's the conceit of the show.
The item that I brought was a toy Dalek that was released at the most improbable time in the show's history. I think it was 1998 I got it. So when the TV movie was kind of dead in the water, it looked like there was no future for the show. And this toy Dalek, I'll show it to you.
Oh, hell yeah. This is like Library of Impossible Things Plus. I get to see it.
This is such a not podcast thing. It's so visual. So this is the Dalek.
Ooh,
you'll have to describe to the listeners what's happening.
So it's kind of like a Dalek with the back end sliced away, so it's a box.
So I've opened it up.
Oh, and inside, yes. Tell them what's inside.
Well, inside you've got a whole kind of play set. So there's a little TARDIS in there, and if you open up the TARDIS, inside there's a tiny figure of the Doctor.
Oh my
sure
God!
You can see that very well. There's a little Tom Baker in there. Above that, there's an Emperor who opens to reveal Davros. There's
Spoiler
a
alert!
And there's a little Dalek on a ball bearing.
Exterminate!
So I liked things that were kind of self-contained and tiny, and this is just a really well-crafted toy. It's and like I say, it came out at a time when nothing was happening with Doctor Who. So why the hell they chose to release it at all, I don't know. But it certainly made my Christmas.
It's people that listen that aren't hip to Doctor Who. It's one of the best things about it is just the, what do you call it? Not landscape, but like just the world around it, everything, because it's been around for 60 plus years. There's so much to look at, to read, to get your grubby little mitts on. So much. And
so much of it is sort of weird and self-contradictory, and because it comes from a time before, these days, if Doctor Who was starting now, they'd have a Bible, and they'd have worked out the canon and what they were going to tell, and it would all be totally consistent. It's much more fun that we're looking back over a time when they were publishing weird books about the Daleks in the 60s, where they had Dalek language and Dalek maps and things like the Daleks can't see the color red, which is curious because some of the Daleks are in fact red themselves. So what are they, invisible?
Oh my God! What if that was one of their failed projects? They were like, "We have created the Supreme Dalek. No one can see this Dalek." Oh, hey! I just bumped into it.
Because everyone can see it apart from the Daleks themselves. Yeah. Or the Doctor Who annuals, which had just come to absolutely bizarre, apparently written by people who'd never seen the programme, and certainly illustrated by people who'd never seen what the actors look like. So it's got this rich history of things that don't fit in and don't make sense, and I think that's part of the joy of it, is that actually there was never a canon, So when people complain about kind of the timeless children and say, but it's not canonical, it's like, what canon are you talking about here? Which version of Doctor Who are you talking about? Which who's canon?
If you're objecting to this, go read your Eighth Doctor books. It's fine. They haven't gone away. Some of them are harder to find than others, but
that is true. That is true.
Oh man, I don't think any other show fan quite relate. Maybe Star Trek fans. But to the dead zone where nothing was coming out, and so fans had to keep it alive.
It's a pretty extraordinary period, isn't it? Because it's a point at which it had been killed as dead as the BBC could kill it.
Yeah. And
yet it's sort of one of the most creative periods of Doctor Who in another way, because it's when the publishing came into its own. It's when the comic strips absolutely went into a whole new realm of brilliance. Those Eighth Doctor strips are...
Oh my God, I have The Glorious
phenomenal.
Dead. It's one of the best graphic novels I've ever read.
They're really imaginative. I know Joe speaks very highly of the Eighth Doctor range, which I wasn't so into at the time, but clearly they were doing interesting things with writing. And then the spin-offs, which I couldn't get enough of. I had the Auton series and things like Shakedown, where the Sontarans, and they'd find ways of casting Doctor Who actors in things that weren't quite Doctor Who. So Colin Baker was playing the Stranger, and Sylvester McCoy on audio was playing the Professor. It's just a really rich period. And at the time, we were also cross that Doctor Who wasn't on the television, but we maybe should have appreciated a bit more just how much Doctor Who there was available, and the quality of the writing about it. Suddenly people were writing in a way that was almost kind of academic about Doctor Who, both in universe and as a television phenomenon. And the quality of this writing was really high. The articles in Doctor Who magazine in the 90s and early noughties were remains a high point actually of how seriously can we write about this as an important piece of television history.
Yeah, so remarkable. And so many of the people in that period when the show wasn't on then became a part of the show itself when it came back, or the audiobooks, the conventions, just this this whole ecosystem. That's the word I was looking for.
That's it.
And it's so warm and loving. I mean, part of it is just the ethics of the show. The guy's against genocide. That's a nice fundamental. He's kind, or they are kind, because now they can switch genders canonically.
I mean, against genocide unless he's carrying out genocide himself.
Well, then it's a little tricky. Yeah, of course.
I mean, the Doctor's never violent, except when he's violent.
Yeah, well, a few contradictions. But yeah, very nice. And thanks to Cy Hart for doing that show. And Cy, as far as I can tell, got his start on Hamster with a Blunt Penknife. So let me recommend that too. If you've never watched Doctor Who, what are you doing? Start it. But also, that's a nice companion to listen to the commentary along with a show. Or if you've seen the new one and you love it, but you want to get into classic, definitely get with the Ham Fam and join us as we nicely discuss a show that we love. That's great. Okay, I think we did enough, and I'll let you get on with your evening. Yeah. Anything that we missed?
I don't think so, no. Are you happy?
I'm so happy. This was great.
This was really good fun.
Yeah. And you'll be back again.
Well, exactly. So if you want to pick up on any threads,
Hell yeah, hell yeah. They can't get to know you too much, too fast. All right. Well, we'll see you next time. In this grouping, we'll be doing chapters 7 through maybe 11. I'll figure out the exact details and post about it. And what else? I'm covering The Thing with a fellow friend of DeSoto. That's a fan of a different podcast called The Greatest Generation. And I'll be covering, oh man, there was one more. The Bram Stoker's Dracula. And, and possibly the Spanish language version, which apparently is also very good. So stay tuned for that. And have yourselves a wonderful week, month. To our robot overlords, we honor you and praise you. Thanks for not devouring all of us. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
I usually leave with a quote from the book, something that sums it all up. Do you have any ideas? I'm scrolling back. It's probably something early. Hey, it was his first time. I wanted to scare him. That could be you.
That could be.
A huge thanks to James Lark of jameslark.co.uk for providing our wonderful theme song. Thank you, James.